February 1843, Wisconsin Territory. The wind did not howl. It was a low-frequency physical pressure that seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating the pine logs of the cabin. It was the kind of cold that made iron brittle, and a man's beard a mask of ice just walking to the woodpile. Inside the small one-room cabin of Silas Veblen, the air was a battleground. Silas sat on a three-legged stool, his front half roasted by the fire, his back half aching with a penetrating chill. He was feeding the fireplace, a massive, roaring entity of flame and smoke, built from fieldstone on the outside of the cabin's gable end. He was feeding it constantly. He had been feeding it since October. He laid another split oak log onto the fire. The flames leapt, a brief, violent spray of sparks catching on the soot-blackened stones. For a moment, a wave of intense heat washed over him, and in that same moment, he felt a corresponding icy draft snake across the floor and curl around his ankles. He looked over at his wife, Ilara, who was huddled on their straw-tick mattress under a pile of every blanket and quilt they owned. She had a persistent dry cough. In the corner, 20 feet from the fire, the wooden water bucket had a thick white skin of ice across its top. Silas Veblen was 34 years old, a carpenter by trade from Ohio, but this land was teaching him that his trade meant little. He had built this cabin exactly as his father had, and as his neighbors had. The logs were sound, saddle-notched. The gaps chinked tight with a mix of clay and dried moss, but the chimney was the heart of the home, and his heart was failing. It was a monster. It consumed wood at a terrifying rate. His days were a grim cycle of felling, hauling, splitting, and feeding. He spent more time fueling his shelter than living in it. He looked at the fire again, not with the comfort of a homesteader, but with the critical eye of a man betrayed. The fire was drawing, yes. It was drawing the smoke up, but it was also drawing every scrap of warm air out of the cabin with it and pulling frozen air in through every tiny, imperceptible crack. The chimney, the very thing meant to provide comfort, was a massive, stone-cold siphon attached to his wall, a vertical river of his own warmth, emptying into the empty sky. He had done everything right by the standards he knew, and by those standards he and Ilara were slowly, exhaustingly freezing. He looked at the ice in the bucket, then at the roaring fire, and a cold, hard realization settled in him. The standard way was wrong. It wasn't that Silas had been lazy in the building. He had, in fact, taken immense pride in the work. He and Ilara had arrived the previous spring, in April of 1842, with 2 oxen, a plough, and a box of precious tools. He had chosen his logs with care, mature white pine, straight and true. The raising had been a community affair. His neighbors, men like Jedediah Brown and Thomas Phelps, men who had been in the territory for 3, maybe 4 years, had come to help. They were good men, tough men, and they knew the way of things. Jedediah, a man whose voice boomed with unearned confidence, had directed the chimney construction. "Build her on the end, Veblen," he'd instructed, spitting tobacco juice onto the raw earth. "Keeps the fire out of the middle of the room, gives you more wall space. That's the way Pa did it in Pennsylvania, and that's the way we do it here." Silas had nodded. It made sense. Why would you put a dirty, smoky thing in the center of your home? So they had built it on the outside. They dug a shallow foundation, laid a base of the largest field stones they could find, and built up, course by course. The flue was a straight, wide square opening, built with smaller stones, and a thick, heavy mortar of red clay and horsehair. It was a proud, massive structure, nearly 5 feet wide at the base, and it tapered handsomely as it cleared the roofline. It looked permanent. It looked correct. The first hint of trouble had come in October. With the first real frost, he'd lit the fireplace for the first time, a celebratory fire. Within minutes, the cabin was opaque with smoke. The smoke eddied, billowed, and refused to rise. Jedediah, visiting, had laughed. "Too small an opening, Silas. You built it too small, too tight. Fire's gotta breathe." So, swallowing his pride, Silas had taken his mason's hammer and widened the fireplace opening, knocking out the side stones until the mouth of the fireplace was nearly 6 feet wide and 4 feet high. It was an enormous, gaping maw. The smoke finally drew. It roared up the chimney, in fact, and with it all the heat. The consequences were immediate and disastrous. The massive open hearth required a massive constant fire. And the draft. The cabin, which had seemed so tight, was revealed to be a sieve. The fire's hunger for air was insatiable. It pulled air from under the door, from the cracks around the single window, even down from the small roof vent, bringing a shower of cold air onto their heads. They hung quilts over the walls, but the cold simply seeped through the stones of the chimney itself. The entire gable end of the cabin, the wall the chimney was built against, was now a radiating wall of pure, penetrating cold. When the fire died down in the middle of the night, the chimney became a refrigeration unit, the massive cold stones sucking every last calorie of warmth from the room. Silas had tried to solve it. He'd chinked and re-chinked. He'd built a temporary windbreak of pine boughs outside the door. He'd even tried to reduce the fireplace opening with a temporary board. But the smoke had poured back in. He was trapped. The system was failing, and the winter had just begun. In early March, with his woodpile dwindling at a catastrophic rate, Silas took his oxen and sledge to the small trading post at the river fork. He was a desperate man, planning to trade precious seed corn for cut cordwood. The post was thick with the smell of wet wool, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Jedediah Brown was there, holding court by the pot-bellied stove. Silas, in his quiet shame, just nodded and moved to the back, trying to talk to the trader. His conversation was overheard by a man he'd never seen before. The man was older, with a shock of white hair and hands that were stained with clay and lime, not just dirt. He was dressed in a strange, European-style wool coat and spoke with a thick German accent. This was Heinrich Bauer, a mason who had settled in a small, isolated valley 5 miles to the north. Bauer listened to Silas's quiet negotiations, then said, his voice rumbling, "You are buying wood to heat the sky." Silas turned, annoyed and defensive. "I'm buying wood to keep my wife from freezing, sir." Jedediah laughed. "Viblin's fire's a hungry one." Bauer ignored Jedediah. He looked at Silas, his eyes sharp and analytical. "Your chimney, it is on the outside of the house, yes?" Silas nodded, confused. "Of course. Where else would it be?" Bauer shook his head slowly. "You build a stone house for the wind, the cold. It loves this. It holds the stone, and the stone holds the cold. You are trying to make a fire in a box of ice." Silas, with nothing left to lose, found himself visiting Heinrich Bauer's cabin 2 days later. From the outside, it was a simple, rough-hewn log structure, smaller than his own. But when Bauer opened the door, Silas was struck, not by a blast of heat, but by a quality of stillness. The air was warm, not hot, not stuffy, but uniformly warm. He stepped inside, his boots clomping on the wood floor. He unwrapped his scarf. He could feel the warmth on his face, his back, his hands, and then he saw it. There was no fireplace. In the center of the cabin, taking up a huge amount of space, was a massive, beautiful structure of plastered-over stone and clay, rising from the floor to the ceiling. It was whitewashed, and there were no visible flames. Bauer saw him looking. "This," he said, tapping the plaster, which was warm to the touch, "is a Kachelofen, a tile oven." He pointed to a small cast-iron door near the floor. "This morning at 6 o'clock I make one fire, small, with dry wood. It burns for 2 hours, hot, very hot. Then I am done." Silas was dumbfounded. "But where is the smoke? Where is the fire now?" Bauer smiled. "The fire is gone, but the heat is inside the stone." He pointed up. "The smoke does not go up, it goes up, then down, then across, then down again, then up to the roof, a long, slow path." He called it a Schornstein, a serpentine flue. "The stone eats the heat from the smoke that leaves my roof. It is cool. I can hold my hand in it." Silas walked around the massive structure. It was radiating a gentle, even heat from every surface. There were no drafts. The air was calm and quiet. "You," Bauer said, "are building a torch to the wind. You must build a box to hold the heat, the mass. The mass is the battery." Silas left Bauer's home with his world turned upside down. A small fire, a chimney in the middle of the house, smoke going down. It was all backward, it was all wrong, and it was the only thing that made sense. Silas spent the rest of that brutal winter not just surviving, but thinking. He sat by his roaring, wasteful fire, and with a piece of charcoal on the back of a wooden shingle, he planned. He could not build a true Kachelofen like Bauer's. He didn't have the skills for the plasterwork, nor the right kind of fire brick for the core, but he had the principles. The heat must be stored. The chimney must be inside the house. The smoke's path must be slowed. He was a carpenter, but now he had to think like a mason, like an engineer. His plan was a hybrid, a frontier adaptation of a European idea. He would tear down the entire, monstrous exterior chimney stone by stone. He would patch the gable-end wall with new logs. Then he would cut a hole in the very center of his cabin floor. He would dig a new massive foundation deep into the earth. From this foundation he would build a new chimney, a central pillar of stone. It would be huge, at least 4 feet square at the base, a monolith of masonry that would pass straight up through the ridge of his roof. The fireplace opening itself would be small and deep, more like an oven. And inside, this was the secret. He would try to build what Bauer had called the serpentine flue. He would use the flattest, densest stones he could find to create internal baffles, forcing the smoke to snake back and forth, up and down, on its way to the sky, shedding its heat into the stone mass at every turn. He knew the risks. This would mean tearing his house apart. He would have a gaping hole in his roof and floor just as the spring rains began. He would lose weeks of planting time. Ilara, seeing the obsessive look in his eyes, the endless, frantic sketching, was terrified. "Silas, what if it doesn't draw? What if we fill the house with smoke and have no way to heat at all?" Jedediah Brown stopped by, saw the sketches on the shingle, and threw his head back and laughed. "In the middle of the floor, Veblen. You'll burn the house down from the inside out. and you'll have to walk around it just to get to bed. It's backward. God's smoke goes up, man, not sideways." Silas just nodded, his jaw set. "Maybe, Jed. Maybe." He didn't argue. He just spent the last frozen weeks of winter hauling stone. He used his sledge to drag massive flat granite slabs from the frozen creek bed, piling them near his cabin door like a dragon hoarding its gold. He found one, a perfect flat 4-inch thick slab of granite, 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. It took him and his oxen 2 days to move it. This, he decided, would be his new hearthstone. It was the foundation of the new plan. The work, the risk, the skepticism of his neighbors, it all faded. He was a man with a singular, radical purpose. The day the thaw firmed the ground, Silas Veblen began. His first act was one of cathartic destruction. He took his heaviest sledgehammer to the old, external chimney. The clay and horsehair mortar was weak, and the stones, which had caused him so much misery, tumbled down in a dusty, sooty avalanche. He saved everyone. They would be reborn in the new structure. He and Ilara worked together, felling 2 new pines to patch the hole in the gable wall, chinking it so tightly it looked as if the chimney had never been there. The cabin already felt more solid. Then the true work. He cut a massive square hole in the plank floor, right in the center of their home. He dug down 3 feet into the cold, dense clay of Wisconsin, laying a footing of gravel and heavy stones. On this, he and his oxen wrestled the massive new hearthstone into place. It was a perfect, level, solid foundation. Now he built up. He became a mason. His hands, raw and bleeding, learned the feel of the stone, the exact consistency of the clay and sand mortar. He built the firebox, small and deep as planned. Then the flue. This was the slow, secret work. He laid the flat baffle stones, cantilevering them from the chimney walls, creating a winding, vertical maze. He had to guess at the aerodynamics. Too tight, and it would block. Too loose, and the heat would escape. He built in 2 small, clean-out doors, using heavy iron plates he'd salvaged, just as Bauer had advised. "Soot will build where the smoke turns," the German had warned. "You must have a way to clean it." The structure grew, a massive square pillar of stone. It passed the halfway point of the walls. It rose past the ceiling height. Silas climbed onto the roof, cut a new hole at the ridge, and framed it. The chimney stack rose course by course until it stood a good 3 feet above the roofline. The cabin was now quite literally built around this single, massive stone core. It had taken him 6 weeks. Planting was late. His neighbors, who had come by to mock, had stopped coming. They just shook their heads. Convinced Veblen had finally lost his mind. When he was finished, he and Ilara stood inside the cabin. The thing dominated the room. It was raw, functional, and frankly, ugly. It was a monster. Silas, his hands trembling with exhaustion and fear, stacked a small, precise pile of kindling inside the new, small firebox. He lit it. A puff of smoke billowed out into the room. Ilara coughed. Silas's heart sank. It was all for nothing. But then, as the kindling caught and the air in the flue began to warm, he heard a sound, a low, deep whoosh. The smoke stopped, hesitated, and was suddenly, powerfully sucked up into the darkness. He put his ear to the stone mass. He could hear the fire roaring like a distant, muffled furnace deep inside the stone. They did not have to wait long. The autumn of 1843 was mild, but in the first week of November, the sky turned a flat metallic grey. The wind swung to the north, and the first blizzard of the season, a true Wisconsin nor'easter, descended. The temperature plummeted from 40 degrees to 10 in a matter of hours. This was the test. Silas followed Bauer's instructions to the letter. At 7 in the morning he loaded the small firebox with dry split oak. He lit it. The fire drew perfectly with that same satisfying muffled roar. He let it burn hot and fast for 2 hours. The stone mass began to warm. He could feel it. At 9, with the fire burned down to a deep bed of glowing coals, he shut the heavy iron damper at the base of the flue. The fire was out. The blizzard hit its full fury. The wind shrieked, and the snow began to pile in drifts against the walls. Silas and Ilara waited. They sat in their cabin, listening. The first thing Silas noticed was the silence. The wind was a terror outside, but it was not inside. The drafts were gone. The fire, in its hunger, was no longer sucking the cold in. He walked to the wall where the old chimney had been. It was cold, as was the rest of the exterior wall, but it was not radiating cold. Then he walked to the center of the room, to the massive stone chimney. He placed his bare hand on the rock. It was not hot, it was warm, a deep, penetrating, radiant warmth. It was like a living thing, breathing heat into the room. Ilara, who was usually huddled in bed by this point, was sitting at the table mending a shirt. She wasn't wearing her shawl. The water bucket in the corner had no ice. The air in the cabin was not hot, but it was stable. It was comfortable. Silas checked the small, precious thermometer he had hung on the wall. It read 56 degrees. On a day like this, with the old chimney, he knew it would have been 35, with a 30-foot-per-hour wind blowing across the floor. The difference was not just 22 degrees. It was the difference between survival and misery. Later that night, at the peak of the storm, there was a frantic pounding on the door. It was Jedediah Brown, his beard a solid block of ice, his wife and 2 small children huddled behind him. "Silas, our chimney. The clay's cracked, the smoke. It's coming in, not out, and the cold. We can't. Can we just—" He stopped, stepping inside. His eyes went wide. He felt the air. It was calm. It was warm. He looked at the massive stone structure in the middle of the room. He could see no fire. He looked at Ilara sitting calmly. But where? "Where's the fire, Veblen?" Silas Veblen put his hand on the warm stone. "The fire's in the stone, Jed. It's been in the stone all day. Come in. Bring your family." That winter, the great cold of 44 became a legend in the territory. It broke thermometers and spirits. But for the Veblens, it was merely winter. Jedediah Brown and his family stayed for a week. Jedediah spent most of that time with his hand on the chimney, a look of profound, humbled confusion on his face. He asked Silas to explain it again and again. The small fire, the slow smoke, the mass. He left Silas's cabin a changed man, a convert to the backward chimney. The following spring, Jedediah did not just repair his old chimney, he tore it down. He asked Silas to help him build a new one, a central one. Like yours, Silas. Not so big, maybe, but right. Silas helped him. The idea, once mocked, became a contagion of common sense. Thomas Phelps built one next, and the new family that arrived from Vermont, seeing the Veblen and Brown chimneys, copied the design without question. It wasn't that everyone built a perfect copy. Some built smaller. Some couldn't figure out the baffles and just built a massive, straight internal flue. But even that was a quantum leap. By 1850, as the settlement grew into a town, no one in that county built an exterior chimney. The Veblen core, as some called it, became the vernacular. It was just the way it was done. New settlers arriving from the east would scratch their heads. Why do you build it in the middle? Takes up the whole room. And the now grizzled old-timers, men like Jedediah Brown, would just look at them and say, because the cold teaches you if you listen. The legacy was measured in wood piles that lasted the whole winter, in children who didn't cough, in cabins that felt like homes, not windswept boxes. What Silas Veblen had done, and what Heinrich Bauer had taught him, was not magic. It was physics. It was a set of principles that the American frontier, in its rush for quick shelter and its abundance of endless forests, had forgotten. The standard American fireplace was a thermal catastrophe. It was designed for ventilation, not heat. Its entire design was focused on getting smoke out, and in the process, it pulled all the heat with it. Silas's old chimney was an exterior chimney, a thermal bridge that was, for all intents and purposes, a piece of the outside that was bolted to his house, a massive cold radiator sucking heat from his wall. The new design solved three problems. First, thermal mass. The Katchelofen and Silas's hybrid chimney were heat batteries. The stone, dense and heavy, stored the heat from a short hot fire and then radiated it slowly and evenly for 12, 16, even 24 hours. The house was no longer heated by the fire, it was heated by the chimney. Second, heat exchange. The backward serpentine flue was a primitive but brilliant heat exchanger. In a straight flue, 80% of the heat, in the form of 800-degree gas, goes straight up and out. In Silas's flue, that 800-degree gas had to take a long, slow, winding path, forced to scrub against tons of stone. By the time the smoke exited the roof, it was cool, having given all its energy to the masonry inside the house. Third, location. By moving the entire structure inside the thermal envelope of the cabin, any heat that did leak from the chimney stones leaked into the living space, not into the empty sky. Silas Veblen hadn't invented a new technology. He had simply, out of desperation, rediscovered a very old one. Silas and Ilara lived in that cabin for another 43 years. They raised their children in the even, consistent warmth of the stone core. The chimney became the center of their lives. It was where they dried herbs, where they warmed their boots, where they sat and read. It was the warm heart of the Veblen home. Silas became a respected elder, a man known not for his words, but for his thoughtful, methodical, and humble approach to problems. When people would remark on his cleverness, he would just shake his head and run his hand over the stones, now smooth with age. "Bauer taught me," he'd say, and the cold taught Bauer. When he passed in 1887, the cabin was eventually sold and later abandoned as the town moved on. But when a local historical society went to explore the ruins in the next century, they found the log walls had collapsed. The roof was gone, but the chimney was still standing, a perfect 4-foot square column of stone rising from the earth, a monument to a single transformative idea. What Silas Veblen had built was more than a chimney. It was a lesson, baked in clay and stone. He had learned that the consensus, the way it's always been done, is often just a widely shared mistake. He learned that resilience is not about applying more force, a bigger fire, more wood, but about smarter design. He had the humility to listen to an outsider and the courage to tear down his own work when he knew it was wrong. We are all, in a way, building shelters against the cold. We are all managing the resources we have. The ultimate question is whether we are building a torch to the wind, feeding our best efforts into a system that just lets the heat escape, or whether we are building a box to hold the heat. True innovation is not always about the new. Sometimes it is about rediscovering the profound, simple wisdom of the old. The wind and the cold are always out there. The challenge is not to fight them, but to understand them and to build thoughtfully a lasting and durable warmth.